Welcome to Recap King. In this video, we will explain Crows Zero. This movie tells the story of a transfer student who has the ambition to conquer the most violent high school in the country. In the school, many students form factions and fight each other for control of the school. Therefore, he needed to create a faction before finally fighting and taking control. Can he form his own faction and rule the school? Let's find out in Crows Zero. Crows Zero begins by showing the atmosphere at a high school for boys in Japan called Suzuran, where there was never a teacher teaching. The students always did things they liked as they pleased, such as fighting and creating chaos at school without being bound by any rules. In front of the school gate, a young man named Genji Takiya is a new student at Suzuran High School. Genji is the son of the most powerful yakuza boss in the region. He seems to be crossing the name of a student who is considered the most powerful student at Suzuran High School and changing that name to his own. This indicates that he has great ambitions to conquer all students at Suzuran High and become the sole ruler of the school. The scene then switches and shows the opening of the new school year in the hall of Suzuran High School, where several teachers and new students are gathered there. However, the event soon turns into chaos after a new student makes a fuss that angers another new student, a young man named Hiromi Kirishima, who immediately openly challenges the new student to a fight with him. In an instant, chaos ensued, and clashes were inevitable. Until in the end, the students were surprised by the appearance of yakuza members who came to their school to take revenge on a Suzuran High School student named Serizawa Tamao. The yakuza were represented by Ken Katagiri, who stated that Serizawa had beaten one of their members to a pulp and had to experience intensive treatment at the hospital. However, Ken is considered to lack charisma and cannot show the appearance of a yakuza who is known to be violent and cruel, so he is asked to step back and buy drinks for his friends. In contrast, the other yakuza members try to find Serizawa's whereabouts at the school. Meanwhile, Serizawa is seen at the hospital to pick up his best friend, a young man named Tokyo Tatsukawa, who recently experienced treatment after being diagnosed with a cerebral aneurysm that required him to experience surgery shortly. Tokyo shows himself looking fine in front of Serizawa, so his best friend doesn't have to worry about him. However, Serizawa has found out about Tokyo's health condition, which requires immediate surgery to save his life. When going back to school, Serizawa borrows Tokyo's motorbike, even though he is not very good at riding a motorbike. Therefore, Serizawa crashes the car and gets into a chase with a policeman, a man named Yoshinobu, who is hunting him for the violence committed by him that caused a yakuza member to be rushed to the hospital in critical condition. However, Serizawa managed to evade the police and caused the car that Yoshinobu was driving to overturn, causing him to get injured in the head. Meanwhile, at Suzuran High School, the yakuza can't find Serizawa's whereabouts and instead confront Genji, who can easily defeat the yakuza. When Serizawa arrives at school, he looks a little surprised to know that Genji has managed to beat the yakuza who came to their school to take revenge on him. However, not long after, Yoshinobu arrived with the other policemen and immediately arrested Serizawa, which made Genji realize that he was not a random person and was indeed the strongest student at Suzuran High, so Genji was increasingly ambitious to beat him. That night, Genji comes to the nightclub and meets a girl named Aizawa Ruka, an R&B singer and his crush. He didn't really like fighting much. However, he has ambitions to continue in his father's footsteps to become a yakuza boss. Genji then sees his father, a yakuza boss named Hideo Takiya. He proclaims his ambition to conquer Suzuran, a feat which Hideo himself had attempted in his youth but failed. Genji makes Hideo promise to acknowledge him as his successor should he succeed. The following day, when Serizawa and his members were relaxing on the school roof, suddenly Genji came and immediately challenged him to a fight. However, Tokyo, who became Genji's best friend in junior high school, immediately prevented Genji and Serizawa from fighting. Tokyo then tells Genji that he must first defeat the delinquent students from other classes, and defeat a second-year student nicknamed Riendaman, a legendary fighter at the school who is said to be able to overthrow 50 people at once with just his own hands. When Genji asked about Riendaman to the other students, they said that he was a terrible monster in human form, and Genji couldn't defeat him. When Genji finally came face to face with Riendaman, a tall and burly young man, he immediately realized that he was not his match for now, so he decided to prepare himself first before finally fighting him. After that, Genji meets Ken, who thinks he is Serizawa. When Ken tries to fight back, Genji can easily knock him out with one light punch, to which he feels guilty that Ken is apparently a weakling. After clearing up the misunderstanding between them, Ken and Genji finally choose to be friends. They then head to a nightclub, where Genji expresses his desire to rule Suzuran High and Ken happily offers to help him get what he wants. Following Ken's advice, Genji challenges and conquers other delinquent students at Suzuran High School starting from his own class. He manages to defeat a young man named Shuda Tamura, the strongest student in his class. Shuda finally agrees to join Genji and explains the power structure at Suzuran High School and the well-respected student gangs inside and outside the school. One of them is the Front of Armament, a biker gang led by a second-year student named Bando Hideto. He prefers to rule the streets and is not very interested in being the ruler of Suzuran High School, so Genji doesn't have to think about him and his gang. Apart from them, there are delinquent students nicknamed the Ebizuka Trio, which is led by a first-year student named Hiromi Kirishima and has two quite formidable members. Shuda explains that Genji doesn't need to fight Riendaman because he is on another level and has absolutely no interest in the fights between students at Suzuran High. It's different with Serizawa Tamao, who is the highest authority for now because he managed to subdue the delinquent students and founded a faction called the Serizawa Army to rule the school. The Serizawa Army has many very formidable members, one of which is Tokaji Yuji, the mastermind of the Serizawa Army. Shuji Tsutsumoto is an expert in judo martial arts, and the Mikami brothers, who have just joined the Serizawa Army, and Tokyo, who is Serizawa's best friend. Shuda then tells that a young man named Makise Takashi is often defeated by Serizawa but is reluctant to join him. After Shuda reveals Makise's weakness towards women, Genji then goes to Ruka and asks her to come to a nightclub with her female friends. Without the slightest suspicion, she immediately agreed to Genji's request. After that, Genji met Makise and invited him to come to a blind date event called Love Love Group. In the evening, Makise comes to a nightclub with an elegant appearance to attract women who come to the event. However, he turns out to be unable to control himself when dealing with women, and he immediately thwarts Genji and Ken's plans. So Ken orders Shuda to carry out Plan B, where Shuda will pretend to be a troublemaker and annoy the women. Just as Makise was about to defend the girls from Shuda and act like a hero, suddenly Ruka got up and stabbed a fork into Shuda's face, thwarting everything. Upon knowing Genji's true plans, Ruka becomes very angry and disappointed in him and immediately rushes away. Genji turns out to be so frustrated that he bursts into tears when Ruka gets mad at him, so Ken tries to comfort him. Realizing that Genji was doing all that for him, Makise was moved and decided to join Genji and help him defeat Serizawa and his henchmen. After that, Genji challenges a young man named Izaki Shun, who is deceitful and traps Genji into fighting alone against him and his henchmen. However, seeing Genji struggle to get up despite being poorly beaten, Izaki was impressed by Genji's unyielding spirit in the fight to the last drop of blood and decided to join him. With Shuda, Makise, and Izaki, Genji then founded his own group called Genji Perfect Seiya, or GPS for short, which turned out to make Ken very happy to help him achieve his dream of becoming a ruler at Suzuran High School because Ken couldn't do that when he was one of Suzuran's students. On the other hand, Serizawa is alarmed by Genji's rapid rise to power in Suzuran but does not take action. One of Serizawa's lieutenants, Tokaji Yuji, is not so ambivalent and begins covertly attacking members of the GPS, starting with Izaki. When Izaki was alone, Tokaji and his henchmen surrounded him and beat him so severely that he had to be rushed to the hospital for intensive treatment. Knowing that one of his members has been injured, Genji becomes furious and beats up everyone who stands in his way from achieving his wishes and attacks indiscriminately to get enough henchmen to fight Serizawa and his army. Not only injuring Izaki and making Shuda battered, Tokaji then approaches Bando Hideto, leader of the Front of Armament biker gang, with a plan to kidnap Ruka and further aggravate Genji. Tokaji offers some of his henchmen to Bando as long as he is willing to kidnap Ruka and bring her to him. However, he doesn't tell Bando that Ruka is the girl Genji loves. Seduced by Tokaji's offer, Bando agreed to his request. Meanwhile, Ken meets his boss, a man named Yasuki Joji, a yakuza boss who turns out to be a rival to Genji's father, Hideo Takiya. Yasuki knows of the friendship between Ken and Genji and then orders Ken to kill him, disregarding the fact that doing so will incite a war between the yakuza organizations. The task proves to be too much for Ken, who has grown fond of Genji and begins lamenting his decision to become a yakuza in the first place. Because Ken finally chose to save Genji, he decided to meet Genji's father and provide information regarding the assassination plan against Genji ordered by Yasuki. Afterwards, he left a letter for Genji to Hideo and hurried away. Meanwhile, Bando and his gang manage to kidnap Ruka and bring her to Tokaji. Genji gets a call from Ruka, who tells him that she is being held hostage by men with skulls on their jackets and that her captors mentioned the name Bando. Surmising that her captors are the armament, Genji gathers the GPS and proceeds to the biker gang's headquarters. A scuffle between the GPS and the armament is inevitable, where Genji looks very angry because Bando has kidnapped his girl. When Bando finally explained that he didn't know anything about Ruka, who turned out to be Genji's crush, Bando and Genji realized that Tokaji had been playing against them for the personal benefit of Tokaji and the Serizawa army. However, because Genji and his henchmen have battered the armament, Bando demands revenge and asks Makise to cut off one of his ears as an apology. Hearing this, Genji immediately volunteered to serve a sentence because he was the leader of the GPS, who was responsible for all his actions. However, when Genji was about to cut off his ear, Bando immediately stopped him and appreciated his goodwill before finally leaving with his henchmen. Genji and his gang then go to Serizawa army base camp to free Ruka. When Serizawa finally appears there, he immediately beats Tokaji for acting without his knowledge and thinks his actions are wrong because he involve an innocent person like Ruka. Genji and Serizawa then agree to set the day of the fight at 5 o'clock in the afternoon the following day, to coincide with the day that Tokyo will experience surgery at the hospital. That night, Genji met his father, who then gave him a letter from Ken. The next day, Genji and the GPS are ready to take on Serizawa and his army. At the same time, Tokyo is prepared to experience his surgery and bravely walk toward the operating room without being escorted by the medical team. Genji and the GPS finally arrive at the grounds of Suzuran High School, where Serizawa and his army are waiting for them. A fierce battle between Genji Perfect Seiha and the Serizawa army was inevitable. Both sides mustered all their strength to defeat each other. However, because the Serizawa army has far more members than Genji Perfect Seiha, Genji and his henchmen seem overwhelmed. When Genji and his gang were pressed, suddenly Bando and his biker gang appeared, who had come there to help Genji, because Bando was annoyed that Tokaji had incited him and caused several of his men to be beaten because of a completely unnecessary fight. The fight reoccurs and becomes balanced when Bando and his gang join forces with Genji and the GPS, where fighting continues until finally, only Genji and Serizawa are left. They can still stand and fight one-on-one when the others have fallen. A fierce duel took place between them, in which both of them had quite a tough physique and strength that surpassed the other students at Suzuran High School. However, in the end, Serizawa fell down and could not get up again, so he decided to admit his defeat to Genji Takiya. Meanwhile, Ken is seen at a dock with his boss, where Yazuki then takes off his coat and asks Ken to put it on before firing a few shots at him, as he has refused to do his bidding and prefers to save Genji. Ken finally fell into the water and thought that he was dead. However, he managed to survive because Yazuki's suit turned out to be bulletproof and his execution was a ploy to allow him to leave the organization and live a different life. Ken cried happily after realizing that he was still alive and his boss still had the conscience to let him live. Meanwhile, Serizawa receives a call from the hospital, informing him that Tokyo's operation was a success. Several days later, Genji again challenges Riendaman, the final obstacle on his path to ruling Suzuran. Riendaman expresses his belief that Suzuran can never be genuinely conquered and that there will always be someone left to fight. The film ends as the skirmish between Genji and Riendaman begins. The moral that can be learned from this movie is that true strength doesn't come from physical strength and ambition to be the strongest. Still, it comes from determination and a strong will to achieve goals with people who support us with all their hearts and do everything possible to protect our loved ones.